Hi everyone, so today we're continuing with the Ickabog and reading chapter 24, The Bandalaw. Daisy was about to turn 8 years old, so she decided to invite Bert Beamish to tea. A thick wall of ice seemed to have grown up between Daisy and Bert since his father had died. He was always with Roderick Roach, who was very proud to have the son of an Ickabog victim as a friend. But Daisy's coming birthday, which was 3 days before Bert's, would be a chance to find out whether they could repair their friendship. So she asked her father to write a note to Mrs. Beamish inviting her and her son to tea. To Daisy's delight, a note came back accepting the invitation, and even though Bert still didn't talk to her at school, she held out hope that everything would be made right on her birthday. Although he was well paid as carpenter to the king, even Mr. Dovetail had felt the pinch of paying the Ickabog tax, so he and Daisy had bought fewer pastries than usual, and Mr. Dovetail stopped buying wine. However, in honour of Daisy's birthday, Mr. Dovetail brought out his last bottle of Jeroboam wine, and Daisy collected all her savings and bought 2 expensive Hopes of Heavens for herself and Bert, because she knew they were his favourites. The birthday tea didn't start well. Firstly, Mr. Dovetail proposed a toast to Major Beamish, which made Mrs. Beamish cry. Then the 4 of them sat down to eat, but nobody seemed to be able to think of anything to say, until Bert remembered that he'd bought Daisy a present. Bert had seen a bandalaw, which was what people called yo-yos at the time, in a toy shop window, and bought it with all his saved pocket money. Daisy had never seen one before, and with Bert teaching her how to use it, and Daisy swiftly becoming better at it than Bert was, and Mrs. Beamish and Mr. Dovetail drinking Jeroboam sparkling wine, conversation began to flow much more easily. The truth was that Bert had missed Daisy very much, but he hadn't known how to make up with her, with Roderick Roach always watching. Soon, though, it felt as though the fight in the courtyard had never happened, and Daisy and Bert were snorting with laughter about their teacher's habit of digging for bogies in his nose when he thought none of the children were looking. The painful subjects of dead parents or fights that had got out of hand or King Fred the Fearless were all forgotten. The children were wiser than the adults. Mr. Dovetail hadn't tasted wine in a long time, and unlike his daughter, he didn't stop to consider that discussing the monster that was supposed to have killed Major Beamish might be a bad idea. Daisy only realised what her father was doing when he raised his voice over the children's laughter. "All I'm saying, Bertha," Mr. Dovetail was almost shouting, "is where's the proof? I'd like to see the proof, that's all." "You don't consider it proof, then, that my husband was killed?" said Mrs. Beamish, whose kindly face suddenly looked dangerous. "Or poor little Nobby Buttons?" "Little Nobby Buttons," repeated Mr. Dovetail. "Little Nobby Buttons. Now you come to mention it, I'd like proof of little Nobby Buttons. Who was he? Where did he live? Where's the old widowed mother gone who wore that ginger wig? Have you ever met a Buttons family in the city within the city? And if you press me," said Mr. Dovetail, brandishing his wine glass, "if you press me, Bertha, I'll ask you this. Why was Nobby Buttons' coffin so heavy when all that was left of him were his shoes and a shin bone?" Daisy made a furious face to try and shut her father up, but he didn't notice. Taking another large gulp of wine, he said, It doesn't add up, Bertha, doesn't add up. Who's to say, and this is just an idea, mind you, but who's to say poor Beamish didn't fall off his horse and break his neck, and Lord Spittleworth saw an opportunity to pretend that Ickabog killed him and charge us all a lot of gold?" Mrs. Beamish rose slowly to her feet. She wasn't a tall woman, but in her anger she seemed to tower awfully over Mr. Dovetail. "My husband," she whispered in a voice so cold that Daisy felt goosebumps, "was the best horseman in all of Cornucopia. My husband would no sooner have fallen off his horse than you'd chop off your leg with your axe, Dan Dovetail. Nothing sort of a terrible monster could have killed my husband, and you ought to watch your tongue, because saying that Ickabog isn't real just happens to be treason." "Treason?" jeered Mr. Dovetail. "Come off it, Bertha. You're not going to stand there and tell me you believe in this treason nonsense. Why, a few months ago, not believing in the Ickabog Major was saying man, not a tracer." "That was before we knew the Ickabog was real," screeched Mrs. Beamish. "Bert, we're going home." No, please don't go," Daisy cried. She picked up her little box she'd stowed under her chair and ran out into the garden after the Beamishes. "Bert, please, look, I got us Hopes of Heaven. I spent all my pocket money on them." Daisy wasn't to know that when he saw hopes of heaven now, Bert was instantly reminded of the day that he found his father was dead. The very last hopes of heaven he'd ever eaten had been in the king's kitchen, when his mother was promising him that they'd have heard if anything had happened to Major Beamish. All the same, Bert didn't mean to dash Daisy's gifts to the ground. He meant only to push it away. Unluckily, Daisy lost her grip on the box and the costly pastries fell into the flower bed and were covered in earth. Daisy burst into tears. "Well, if all you care about is pastries," shouted Bert, and he opened the garden gate and led his mother away. Oh, well, that sounds like an awful birthday party. Chapter 25. Lord Spittleworth's Problem. Unfortunately for Lord Spittleworth, Mr. Dovetail wasn't the only person who started voicing doubts about the Ickabog. Cornucopia was growing slowly poorer. The rich merchants had no problem paying their Ickabog taxes. They gave the collectors 2 ducats a month, then increased the prices of their pastries, cheeses, hams and wines to pay themselves back. However, 2 gold ducats a month was increasingly hard to find for the poorer folk, especially when with the food at the markets more expensive. Meanwhile, up in the marshlands, children began to grow hollow-cheeked. So that means in the poorer areas, the children weren't getting enough to eat. Spittleworth, who had spies in every city and village, began hearing word that people wanted to know what their gold was being spent on, and even to demand proof that the monster was still a danger. Now, people said of the cities of Cornucopia that their inhabitants had different natures. Jerobomers were supposed to be brawlers and dreamers, the Kurdsburgers peaceful and courteous, while the citizens of Shoeville were often said to be proud, even snooty. But the people of Barronstown were said to be plain speakers and honest dealers. And it was here that the first serious outbreak of disbelief in the Ickabog happened. A butcher called Tubby Tenderloin called a meeting in the town hall. Tubby was careful not to say he didn't believe in the Ickabog, but he invited everyone at the meeting to sign a petition to ask the king, asking for evidence that the Ickabog tax was still necessary. As soon as the meeting was over, Spittleworth's spy, who had of course attended the meeting, jumped on his horse and rode south, arriving at the palace before midnight. Woken by the footman, Spittleworth hurriedly summoned Lord Flapoon and Major Roach from their beds, and the 2 men joined Spittleworth in his bedroom to hear what the spy had to say. The spy told the story of the treasonous meeting, then unfurled a map which he'd helpfully circled the houses of the ringleaders, including that of Tubby Tenderloin. "Excellent work," growled Roach. "We'll have all of them arrested for treason and slung in jail. Simple." "It isn't simple at all, said Spittleworth impatiently. "There were 200 people at this meeting, and we can't lock up 200 people. We haven't got room for one and another. Everyone will just say it proves we can't show the Ickabog's real." "Then we'll show 'em," said Flapoon, "and wrap 'em up like we did Beamish and leave 'em up by the marsh to be found, and people will think the Ickabog got 'em." "Is the Ickabog supposed to have a gun now?" snapped Spittleworth, "and 200 cloaks in which to wrap its victims?" "Well, if you're going to sneer at our plans, my lord," said Roach, "why don't you come up with something clever yourself?" That was exactly what Spittleworth couldn't do. Cajole his sneaky brains though he might, cajole, his sneaky brains though he might, he couldn't think of any way to frighten the Cornucopians back into paying their taxes without complaint. What he needed was proof that the Ickabog really existed, but where was he to get it? Pacing along in front of the fire after the others had gone back to the bed, Spittleworth heard another tap on his bedroom door. "What now?" he snapped. Into the room slid the footman, Cankerby. "What do you want? Out with it quickly. I'm busy," said Spittleworth. "If it pleases your lordship," said Cankerby, "I happened to be passing your room earlier, and I couldn't help hearing about that there treasoners' meeting in Barronstown, what you, Lord Flapoon and Major Roach was talking about." "Oh, couldn't help it," said Spittleworth in a dangerous voice. "I thought I should tell you, my lord. I've got evidence that there's a man here in the city within the city that thinks the same as those traitors in Barronstown," said Cankerby. "He wants proof just like them butchers do. Sounded like treason to me when I heard about it." "Well, of course it's treason," said Spittleworth. "Who dares say such things in the very shadow of the palace? Which of the king's servants dares to question the king's word?" "Well, as to that," said Cankerby, shuffling his feet, "some would say that's very valuable information. Some would—" "You tell me who it is," snarled Spittleworth, seizing the footman by the front of his jacket, "and then I'll see whether you deserve payment. Their name. Give me their name." It's Dan Dovetail," said the footman. Dovetail, I know that name, said Spittleworth, releasing the footman, who staggered sideways and fell into an end table. Wasn't there a seamstress? His wife, sir. She died, said Canterbury, straightening up. Yes, said Spittleworth. He lives in that house by the graveyard, where they never fly a flag without a single portrait of the king in their windows. How do you know he expressed these treasonous views? I happened to overhear Mrs. Beamish telling the scully maids what he said. You happen to hear a lot of things, don't you, Canterbury? Commented Spittleworth, feeling in his waistcoat for some gold. Very well, here are 10 ducats for you. Thank you very much, my lord, said the footman, bowing low. Wait, said Spittleworth as Canterbury turned to go. What does he do, this Dovetail? What Spittleworth really wanted to know was whether the king would miss Mr. Dovetail if he disappeared. Dovetail, my lord, he's a carpenter, said Canterbury, and bowed himself out of the room. A carpenter, repeated Spittleworth out loud. A carpenter. And as the door closed on Canterbury, another of Spittleworth's lightning ideas hit him, and so amazed was he at his own brilliance that he had to clutch the back of the sofa because he felt he might topple over. Do one more chapter today. Chapter 26, A Job for Mrs. de Dovetail. Daisy had gone for school and Mr. Dovetail was busy in his workshop next morning when Major Roach knocked on the carpenter's door. Mr. Dovetail knew Roach as the man who lived in his old house and who'd replaced Major Beamish as head of the Royal Guard. The carpenter invited Roach inside, but the Major declined. We've got an urgent job for you at the palace, Dovetail, he said. A shaft of the king's carriage is broken and he needs it tomorrow. Already, said Mr. Dovetail. I only mended that last month. It was kicked, said Major Roach, by one of the carriage horses. Will you come? Of course, said Mr. Dovetail, who was hardly likely to turn down a job from the king. So he locked up his workshop and followed Roach through the sunlit streets of the city within the city, talking of this and that until they reached the part of the royal stables where the carriages were kept. Half a dozen soldiers were loitering outside the door, and they all looked up when they saw Mr. Dovetail and Major Roach approaching. One soldier had an empty flour sack in his hand, and another a length of rope. Good morning, said Mr. Dovetail. He moved to walk past them, but before he knew what was happening, one soldier had thrown the flour sack over Mr. Dovetail's head, and two more had pinned his arms behind his back and tied his wrists together with rope. Mr. Dovetail was a strong man. He struggled and fought, but Roach muttered in his ear, Make one sound and it'll be your daughter who pays the price. Mr. Dovetail closed his mouth. He permitted the soldiers to march him inside the palace. Though he couldn't see where he was going, he soon guessed, though, because they took him down 2 steep flights of stairs and then onto a third, which was made of slippery stone. When he felt the chill on his flesh, he suspected that he was in the dungeon, and he knew it for sure when he heard the turning of an iron key and the clanking of bars. No. Bruno's decided he would like to go outside. The soldier threw Mr. Dovetail onto the cold stone floor. Somebody pulled off the hood. The surroundings were almost completely dark, and at first Mr. Dovetail couldn't make out anything around him. Then one of the soldiers lit a torch, and Mr. Dovetail found himself looking at a pair of highly polished boots. Let me just get Bruno a toy so that there we go. Now we can read in peace. Where are we up to? It's like magic. Look, straight to sleep. He looked up. Standing over him was a smiling Lord Spittleworth. Good morning, Dovetail, said Spittleworth. I have a little job for you. If you do it well, you'll be home with your daughter before you know it. Refuse or do a poor job and you'll never see her again. Do we understand each other? 6 soldiers and Major Roach were lined up against the cell wall, all of them holding swords. Yes, my lord, said Mr. Dovetail in a low voice. I understand. Excellent, said Spittleworth. Moving aside, he revealed an enormous piece of wood, a section of fallen tree as big as a pony. Beside the wood was a small table bearing a set of carpenter's tools. I want you to carve me a gigantic foot, Dovetail. A monstrous foot with razor-sharp claws. On top of the foot, I want a long handle so that a man on horseback can press the foot into the soft ground to make an imprint. Do you understand your task, carpenter? Mr. Dovetail and Lord Spittleworth looked deep into each other's eyes. Of course, Mr. Dovetail understood exactly what was going on. He was being told to fake proof of the Ickabog's existence. What terrified Mr. Dovetail was that he couldn't imagine why Spittleworth would ever let him go after he created the fake monster's foot, in case he talked about what he'd done. Do you swear, my lord, said Mr. Dovetail quietly, do you swear that if I do this, my daughter won't be harmed, and that I'll be permitted to go home to her? Of course, Dovetail, said Spittleworth lightly, already moving to the door of the cell. The quicker you complete the task, the sooner you'll see your daughter again. Now every night we'll collect these tools from you, and every morning they'll be brought back to you, because we can't have prisoners keeping the means to dig themselves out, can we? Good luck, Dovetail, and work hard. I look forward to seeing my foot. And with that, Roach cut the rope binding Mr. Dovetail's wrist and rammed the torch he was carrying back into a bracket on the wall. Then Spittleworth, Roach, and the other soldiers left the cell, the iron door closing with a clang. A key turned in the lock, and Mr. Dovetail was left alone with the enormous piece of wood, his chisels, and his knives. Okay, so there we go with 3 chapters today. I'll try and do another 3 tomorrow, hopefully, or 2, so that we can try and catch up a bit with J.K. Rowling's writing. There's a purple mash task for you, so have a go at that. I'm hoping that you've all been paying really close attention, because the story is starting to get very twisty and turny now. I'm very interested in seeing what happens. And I'll see you tomorrow with the next chapters.